This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. This Friday's show begins with our grain market update for the week from K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien and senior economist with the International Grains Program, Guy Allen. Dan and Guy share insight on acres and pricing anticipated for the year ahead from information they have gleaned from the USDA's 99th Agricultural Outlook Forum in Washington, D.C. Also ahead, K-State Precision Agriculture economist Terry Griffin joins us for a conversation on the rate at which technology in the world of precision ag is being adopted by producers. We end with this week's agricultural weather report from K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. Chip explains the 53-degree swing we've experienced overnight in parts of the state on Wednesday of this past week, and the importance of having severe weather plans in place for a few systems we are anticipating in the week ahead. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are joined now by two very great guests that we are used to hearing from here on the show. They're joining us from D.C. today, so thank you so much, gentlemen. We have with us Guy Allen. He's our senior economist with the International Grains Program here at K-State, as well as Dan O'Brien, our K-State grain economist. So, gentlemen, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Samantha.
Absolutely. Like I said, you guys are currently in D.C. for that USDA Ag Outlook Conference, Dan, that we've been talking about the past several weeks during our grain market commentary. And the time has finally come. You guys are in D.C.
Yes, conference is started on Thursday, and it generally begins with the overall outlook by the USDA chief economist. In this case, it's Seth Meyer. And he gives on the ag side acreages, prices in general. Now, all the specifics come in later on in the conference. But in terms of the acres, there's, I guess, not a lot of change. The USDA did come out and give a projection of 91 million acres planted, and their previous projection had been 92, so that's probably a little bit positive for the corn market. Really no change for the soybean market at 85.5 million acres planted. And I think that's probably a little bit lower than what some people had projected. And you stand back and look at the markets right now, we have awfully high soybean prices and corn prices. So I guess they're arguing back and forth on that. And the wheat numbers came in at 11.1% increase. And there were comments this morning that some of those acres are probably planted for, on the one hand, if you look at positively for potential of garnering high prices, on the other side, because of high crop insurance prices. So that's how we would view that out in the West. Probably the bigger story, in my view, and Guy, you can comment on this for sure, is that when they come up with their price projection. So for this marketing year, corn is averaging $6.70 a bushel. They came in with a corn projection for next year of a drop of about over $1 down to $5.60. And what's kind of buried in that assumption is that even off of those 91 million acres planted, they're looking at record high trendline yields, probably 180, 181, something like that. And with that, you're looking at probably a 15 billion bushel plus corn crop. No drought, no carryover problems in the Western Corn Belt that are enough to derail the train of a large crop. So that would be a drop of, like I say, $1.10 for corn. For sorghum, from $6.90 this year down to $5.60. And of course, that affects us in Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas quite a bit. For soybeans, an average price this year of $14.30, but then next year a drop of $1.40 down to $12.90. So I'm sure our soybean folks will be looking at that and wondering about where all that comes from. I think a lot that's behind that guy probably has to do with the large Brazilian crop. And it was also apparent this morning as they were talking about that they're not really counting on much more of a drop in Argentina. And that may be a heroic assumption.
Yes. Well, Seth went on to explain that there's significant risks on both sides of that equation, both on the supply and the demand and the weather. At the end of the day, the weather, he commented, is going to predominantly will drive the complex. But and that's what I really concur on. I think their production outlook and subsequently their price outlook is pretty optimistic on that. And I think from base, so
their production outlook is optimistic. Their price outlook is pessimistic.
That's right. So look, significant risk on the production side with weather, not only in the U.S. dry in the Western Corn Belt, but in Argentina, still dry in Europe, still dry in critical parts of China. We're seeing drier weather in Australia, so they should come off their record production, and even dry in that critical part of West Africa around Nigeria and that. So I don't think we have much of a weather premium in the market. On the demand side, look, we continue to have a strong U.S. dollar. And if you look at the trade-weighted currency index, it makes U.S. grain look very, very expensive. We have seen international freight rates come down significantly. So that helps us, one, with cheaper freight rates, but two, it keeps us more competitive from a comparative advantage situation where your markets that are closer, such as Black Sea, Australia, even Europe, it's not much of an advantage. I think we have seen some demand destruction there, and these high prices, I think, are sort of doing their jobs. But he also emphasized the tightness that we're seeing, particularly in corn and oilseeds. Wheat is tight as well for a number of years, particularly if you take out China. And, I think we're still precariously on that knife's edge, and that's right. What keeps me a bit more optimistic on price.
I would agree. I should also say, too, they projected an $8.50 wheat price for the next marketing year. We're at $9 again this year. So they did talk quite a bit about the triple dip La Nina that has happened, and really the implicit assumption that will, shouldn't say completely go away, but that will have better moisture and better crops this year.
Well, the weather forecasters have been saying for 6 months now we should see that La Nina situation fade and change to El Nino. We just haven't seen that happen yet. And the latest 90-day forecast doesn't see it happening really before May. And that's what makes me particularly concerned for the western grain belt in the U.S. We're very, very dry out there as drought conditions persist. And we got a dichotomy at the moment between east and western grain belt, but significant amount of grain coming out of there, particularly for the winter wheat situation. And as we go into planting here for both spring wheat and the summer crops.
And as kind of a look out farther into the future, there's discussion about anticipated 25% growth in crush capacity over the next few years still. Yeah. And they're looking at renewable diesel, biodiesel continuing to grow. And, the long term of that, if you build those plants, will the acres come? I guess there'll be a demand for them. But how will the increased capacity balance with the overall demand? I guess.
Yeah, I think there's 28 plants on the drawing board there. I don't think all those will get built. With the rising interest rates, a lot of these companies are re-reviewing their investment strategies, narrowing their windows for the return on investment and raising their benchmark for the return on investment. So I don't necessarily think all of those will be built, but it is going to dramatically change the crush dynamics in the U.S. going forward. I see that biodiesel, particularly in the whole biofuel situation, continuing to have traction going forward, which is going to drive that oilseed sector. They seem to be quite concerned about the meal, but meal prices are really hanging very, very strong relative today, and we haven't seen that fade yet. Maybe some concern in the future. I'm not as concerned about that as maybe some are. The markets will work it out, I believe, really find that demand. But I think, longer term, need to keep a close eye on that. Which of these plants are built, when they come online at a commission, that's going to change domestic trade flows there. But I see that as all good for production agriculture.
Samantha, I know there's a topic that you and I have talked about in the past, what farm income will be and how farmers will fare. They did project that farm income for next year, coming off of a high, near record high, 2022, that it'll be down tangibly in 2023, and that would mainly be with the lower prices. I think they're balancing bushels and prices together and kind of a horse race to see where that ends up. They talked in cautious tones with regard to what happened with cash rents. So they're saying that, not saying that cash rents won't increase, but that increases will moderate. I was a little unsure exactly what was being said there, but right. Anyway. So again, probably the bigger thing, and I know it's like I say, it's of concern to you. It would be where farm income goes, and they're anticipating a little bit worse year next year than this year.
Yeah, it definitely indicated farm income would still be strong, but less than last year. Look, I don't think these inflationary pressures are going to go away anytime soon. I think some of the message in there was couched in a bit of more macro politics. That's the other thing that keeps me rather bullish commodity prices is I really don't see this inflationary, particularly food and energy inflation, really fading much. They came down last month to report a bit, but the world situation really hasn't changed a whole lot. And I continue to think interest rates are going to continue to go up. Inflation is still going to remain fairly high in those sectors. And that's going to fuel commodity prices a bit higher in the nominal sense. In the real sense, maybe not. But it's just increasingly, I think, particularly for growers to manage that risk and their margin as they buy inputs going into spring and market some of their crop on the output side.
Samantha, any questions for us that you'd like to ask?
Well, you read my mind exactly, Dan. It's like you knew exactly where I was going. That was going to be my next question, was farm income questions in terms of, these anticipated price decreases that we're seeing, because it feels like everything else just keeps going up in price. So when it comes to anticipating decreases, where do our producers, see themselves if that's going to be the case? So you answered that question for me exactly. So that worked out well. And I know that you guys still have a lot more to learn while you're at this conference and a lot more to hear from some of these USDA personnel. So I know we'll probably have a follow-up conversation next week along the same lines with all that you have learned. But thank you so much for carving out time while you're there to speak with us today. I really do appreciate it.
Quite happy to. Thanks.
Thanks, Samantha.
Absolutely. You guys enjoy the rest of that conference and enjoy D.C. Hopefully some nice weather.
Yep.
Yeah.
So far it's pretty nice. I don't think we're quite as cold as is reported back home. But I'm sure by the time we get back home, we'll pay the price.
How cold is it this morning in Manhattan?
It was fairly chilly this morning. I woke up to 7 degrees. So.
Oh, okay. That would be a bit chilly.
We're going to get softened up coming out here.
I think it's supposed to be 80 degrees on the weekend. So maybe they'll bring the cherry blossom.
Right.
There you go. That'd be wonderful. Well, hopefully you guys get to enjoy that. But once again, thank you both so much for all the insight you provided today.
Thanks. Take care.
You as well. Once again, everyone, that was K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien, as well as Guy Allen, the senior economist with the International Grains Program here at K-State, joining us for this week's Grain Market Update. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are joined now by a special guest. His name is Terry Griffin, and he serves as a K-State Precision Ag economist here at the university. And he's joining us for a discussion on a recent report that was dropped earlier this past week. And it was with the USDA, and it's on the adoption of precision agriculture on U.S. farms. So, Terry, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here as always, and I look forward to discussing this new report, and I will be using the content for a lot of my extension and outreach for the next foreseeable future.
Absolutely. A lot of significant data gleaned in this article itself, this publication. And it really was looking at the adoption of precision agriculture. But I think when we hear precision agriculture, we also hear about digital agriculture. So are these terms synonymous? What does that really mean?
So when the concept was in its infancy, let's say in the 1990s, we used the word precision agriculture, and it implied a few things. And in reality, precision may not have been the best word then. But over time, that word, which largely reflected the equipment that was used within the farm gates, has evolved into a term digital agriculture, because a large portion of the emphasis has been on the use of data that come from that equipment and other sources. So we're using a more of a broad term, digital agriculture, to reflect precision ag and other information technologies applied to agriculture.
That makes sense for sure. And the data we're going to be talking through today was collected through a survey looking at the adoption of this technology by U.S. producers. And the adoption we're talking about took place between 96 and then 2019. So a large span of time we're talking about here.
Yes, the USDA surveys go back quite a bit, and they've focused on different states throughout time, and last several years they focus on a different crop each iteration, such that the major crops are surveyed every, let's say, 5 years or so.
Those major crops, I think Kansas, you said, covers all of them when we were talking before, except for rice?
That's correct. So the major crops that are the focus of the survey include corn, soybean, winter wheat, grain sorghum, and rice. And in the past, it has included sunflowers and also livestock, cow, calf, hogs, dairy. And Kansas has been surveyed for all of those except for rice.
Absolutely, yeah. All of those crops, familiar areas for us here in Kansas. So when we're thinking about the results of this survey, when we think about the most popular technology types that were adopted, what comes to mind?
So the most adopted technologies typically have the word automated in their names. and there's a reason for that. They tend to make life a little bit easier than without the technology. So, for instance, automated guidance is the one we normally look at when we want to see how much technology is being used. And there's lots of high tech that goes into automated guidance, but the user doesn't have to understand any of it. So it's embodied in the technology. The user is endowed with the ability to use it. And so automated guidance is one of the technologies that is the most adopted. The data technologies, yield mapping, soils mapping, have a lot lower adoption rates. And for instance, soil maps have been under 25% ever since the 1990s, and they continue to be less than a fourth of all planted acres. So automated guidance, we're over 70% of corn farms that are using automated guidance now.
So when it comes to automated guidance, if producers tuning in are thinking, well, what does that exactly apply to? Are we talking self-steering tractors in this case, or?
Well, so when I refer to automated guidance, it's not purely autonomous. You know, there is a cab, there is a seat, there is an operator who is in that seat, and they're, as long as they are not interacting with the steering wheel, then it is automated guidance making parallel passes through the field. Other guidance technologies would also include light bars, which still requires the operator to make manual steering corrections, but for the most part, these are what we would consider automated guidance. Auto steer would be one phrase we would use by some companies, but guidance systems in general.
And you hinted at this earlier, but kind of the caveat between these two different types of technology that you've said, are the most frequently talked about is the benefit to producers that they're removing themselves from the equation quite a bit. It's benefiting them in the long term, their personal life. It's allowing for more efficiencies, really.
It is. So one of the things I like to think about when it comes to agricultural technology, whether the technology is information-based, data-intensive, or if it's embodied into the technology itself. So, for instance, automated guidance, automated section control, and so forth endows the operator with lots of high technology, but it's such that they do not have to know much about the technology to make use of it. That's the opposite when it comes to data, yield monitor data, soils data, and so forth, because with automated guidance, it's readily adopted. And if you ask farmers, for instance, if I came to your farm and removed the technology and you couldn't get it back, how much would you pay me for that not to happen? And if you run that little academic thought experiment, get people thinking like, well, I'm not going to do without it. And you think of it this way. As an economist, I look at the world through the benefit-cost lens, and we look at the benefits as dollars and cents as well as the cost as well as being in dollars and cents. But what if we make it a little bit more complicated and look at satisfaction? Economists refer to this as utility. As a benefit, what about the quality of life? Does the technology improve the quality of life for the equipment operator and maybe the rural household as well, their extended families? Automated guidance could be similar to putting a cab on a tractor in the late 70s. And, you could think about how that improved hearing. Maybe their ears are not ringing at the end of the day due to having less noise, less fatigue. Well, that same idea can be applied to automated guidance. There's less fatigue and some other benefits. On the cost side, the opposite of quality of life we would think of as human capital. Human capital is a good thing, but it's not costless to arrive at. We have to invest time and effort to learn how to do something, maybe even money. If you think about going to college, you get a degree, you've got human capital, but it's not easy to get. It's not costless. You've got to invest time, effort, and money. Well, the same is true of data technologies. It takes more skill to make use of it than it did without the technology. With automated guidance, if you think about it in pure sense, it's easier to operate a machine with automated guidance than it was before you had automated guidance. So the quality of life and human capital ratio, I believe, helps explain a lot about the adoption trends.
And if producers are tuning in and they're thinking, well, I haven't really adopted any precision ag on my own operation yet, or, there's a new area of precision agriculture that I'm interested in exploring, but I just haven't really, stepped off the cliff quite yet in exploring that myself fully. What advice would you give producers that are trying to kind of just figure out where they currently stand with this technology?
So in general, we go back to the benefit-cost ratio, and I encourage people to consider the benefits. The costs are much easier to estimate because we can see the cost from a dealership, for instance. We know exactly how much investment we'll need to make. The benefit side is more vague at times, and we need to ask ourselves, will the perceived benefits outweigh the total cost? And if the answer is no, then I think that answers their question. They shouldn't go any further. And I would remind our listeners that the fear of missing out, what the younger generations may call FOMO, the fear of missing out, should not go into the decision-making process. A lot of producers have explained that they feel like they're getting left behind. Their neighbors and competing farmers have more technology, but that's not a good reason to adopt. A good reason to adopt is when the benefits outweigh the cost.
Absolutely. Yeah, this isn't a situation where you want to try and keep up with the Joneses. These investments are huge.
Exactly.
Great advice there, Terry, for sure. And I can't thank you enough for joining us today. I know this report has recently been released, so if listeners are tuning in and they're wanting to maybe read through it themselves, it's quite thick, quite intimidating, but a lot of great information. So if listeners are wanting to do that, where can they find it at?
Sure. There will be a link to the USDA website from our AgManager.info. So all of our listeners are familiar with the K-State Farm Management website we affectionately call AgManager. So if you go to AgManager.info, it should still be towards the top of the list. You can search my name and find it, and it will take you to the home URL, which is housed at USDA.
Wonderful. Well, I'll link to it as well in our show notes, which can be found on agtoday.net as always. But Terry, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Samantha. It's a joy to be here.
Absolutely. It's a joy to have you. Once again, everyone, that was K-State Precision Ag economist Terry Griffin joining us for a conversation on adoption of precision agriculture on U.S. farms. We're cutting to a short break now, but still ahead on agriculture today. We're going to be rounding out this week's programming with our meteorologist here at K-State, Chip Redmond. Chip again brings information on the tumultuous week that we've had in the weather world, including insight on the ups and downs of our weather, which resulted in a 53-degree swing overnight on Wednesday. While we're quite cold right now, Chip anticipates that the storm system many of us will encounter this weekend will bring in again some warmer temperatures, but that those temperatures are going to be quite short-lived with other storm systems coming in and bringing the cold back. So if you're wanting to know more about what we can expect in the week or so ahead weather-wise, be sure to stay tuned so you can hear that update from Chip. Once again, K-State's meteorologist Chip Redmond will be closing out today's show ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are joined now by Chip Redmond, our K-State meteorologist, for this week's agricultural weather report to round out today's show. So, Chip, thanks so much for joining us.
Yep, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, this past week, another chaotic week in terms of weather. We had some warm temps and then not so warm temps.
Yeah, we warmed up over the weekend, and then Mother Nature slammed the door on us Wednesday morning. And temperatures fluctuated quite a bit with that. And where Kansas is sitting right now in the middle part of the United States where it usually does sit. But we have really, really warm air that's building off to our south and east, and really, really cold air off to our west and north. And those air masses keep colliding, and the jet stream is right in between them. And so we get this push of warm air northward. And then as a storm system moves through, a cold front shoves that warm air down, and we get cold air. So we're getting really both ends of the spectrum pretty quickly. In fact, Wednesday morning, we had up to a 53-degree temperature change from Thursday morning. So big temperature swings as a result. And unfortunately, it wasn't a great track for precipitation this go around. But a lot of wind to go with these big temperature changes that brings the typical Kansas wind that's chaotic.
Absolutely, yeah. The below normal precipitation this past week, that was for most of the state, right?
Yeah, we only saw a little bit of moisture in the far east where they saw some rain, just about a tenth of an inch or so. And then the far northwest saw some snow, not enough to really accumulate worth anything. So below average. And just looking at the central region of the state, that's been kind of the theme. We're continuing the really dry, which is why we have exceptional drought, especially the south central part of the state. Around the Manhattan north central area, we've had above normal moisture so far this year, so we're still living off that surplus, but it's decreasing each week by a little over a tenth of an inch a week.
Sure, and that mixture of, some rain, impactful rains in our areas or precipitation in our areas with warm conditions, it's led to some greening up of some trees, right?
Yeah, we're starting to see the first hints. Buds are starting to come out. Looking at nationally, the green up is progressing northward at a record rate. It's very, very early in a lot of places, especially in southern Oklahoma and south and east of there. They've got trees that are budding out and bloomed out already that aren't normally till March. So with the moisture that we have in the ground right now and the warmer temperatures we've seen, things are starting to progress, and that definitely leads to concern as we get further into spring where they mature or start to mature with blooms and whatnot, that we could definitely be seeing some freeze potential, at least with not so late spring freezes, but late relative to just how warm we've been.
Right, especially with the fluctuating, how quick the changes have happened that we've experienced as of late, too.
Yeah, as fast as we saw it drop down this week, we're going to see it go back up this weekend, and then we'll see a very similar thing next week. And so until we kind of equal out these air masses and get more of a less active storm pattern, we're going to see these big swings continue.
Sure, and that is going to bring some storms for us next week, potentially?
Yeah, so this past system was relatively dry. We just didn't get that Gulf moisture northward. This next system is going to be a little bit further south, and we'll actually see the low develop in western Kansas and move east. And that'll bring in a kind of a classic scenario of Gulf moisture is going to stream northward, get a south dry line, and we'll get isolated severe storms develop in hopefully far western Kansas along that dry line. And then they're going to form a line and go east. So wherever these storms form into the east is likely going to see precipitation. How much is going to be dependent. Convective nature means isolated, heavier amounts, but anywhere from a half to as much of an inch of moisture is possible, especially for eastern Kansas.
Yeah, and this isn't a single event we're talking about. We're thinking multiple storms throughout next week.
Yeah, so that's just this weekend. That's Sunday into Monday, and the storms could be severe. So think about your severe weather plan and get warnings the right way. The next system comes in, looks like Tuesday time frame. It looks like a drier storm system, and then kind of hopefully one of the last few ones before maybe we can calm things out a little bit is the later next week where we've got any realm of the spectrum possible from snow to nothing. But that storm will likely be more impactful.
And bring some cold weather.
Yep, that's going to transition us into at least a colder pattern. At this point, we're looking at the first weekend of March. Will likely be colder, and then we'll carry that into the following week. Beyond that, there's some uncertainty, but cold air looks like it's going to try to dominate more than the warm air for at least into mid-March, and that will likely mean probably a drier pattern for us to persist.
Sure. Well, good to keep in mind, Chip. Thanks so much for these updates.
Yep. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Once again, everyone, that was K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond providing this week's agricultural weather report. That concludes this week's programming. We'll be back with more on Monday on Agriculture Today.